So we've talked about racism, and we've talked about institutional racism, and now we're going to talk about sexism. And I thought it would be interesting to focus it a little and give specific concrete examples of medical sexism, because obviously, like racism and all the isms, sexism is fairly pervasive. But one area where it is, one can see the effects kind of clearly is in the medical sphere, particularly when it comes to reproductive health. So you've got two readings. One of them is a paper predicting the effects of overturning Roe versus Wade before it happened, although the writing was pretty much on the wall. The decision Dobbs, it was already clear that a majority of the justices were tending towards a decision that would overturn Roe. And of course, it has now been over a year since Roe was overturned. So we can actually know if some of the effects that they predict in that paper came true. But a lot of what they were saying was already true, and there were examples of ways that people had got round the protections of Roe already, and now the protections of Roe have been removed. Also, you've got a review of this book by Delson about medical sexism. So let's start with that. Delson gives a nice example. This is sort of her main example that she starts the book with to sort of explore in detail of a very routine practice that affects all women of reproductive age who want access to the pill, who want access to hormonal birth control. And it is just an accepted practice that you cannot be prescribed the pill. Well, first of all, you can't just buy it over the counter as you can with many other medicines, and certainly many medicines that have been so widely used for such a long time as hormonal birth control. It's not available over the counter, and furthermore, in order to get prescribed it, you have to go through tests, pap tests or pelvic exams. And it is just generally acknowledged, studies have been done, that these tests are not medically necessary. They're medically unnecessary. They're not, in fact, doing tests of that frequency is advised against by the main medical organizations. So here is a law that the doctors follow that inconveniences, to put it mildly, all women who want access to this kind of birth control for no good reason. Why isn't this rule overturned? And actually, we can see why when we look at drives by anti-abortion groups to get proven safe medications that have effects that they disapprove of, specifically mifepristone and misoprostol, which of course when combined are an abortifacient. Those have been approved, tested many times, but there is a drive to get their approval revoked. And that's something to look out for under the new administration, because the heads of the testing agencies and the agencies that approve drugs have been replaced with ideologues. So clearly the drive to have these tests and to have these drugs declared unsafe is not their actual safety, not their actual safety for use. So what's the reason? If it's not medical, what's the reason? Well, Delston has a clear idea, and she claims that it is sexism. But let's finish saying the bad effects of this routine practice of requiring these tests. First of all, they're medically unnecessary, but Delston goes on to say they bring about three different kinds of harm. Physical harm, the harms of undergoing these tests, which are not pleasant for reasons that are not apparent. And there's also the harm of knowing that you're being forced to undergo something painful that is unnecessary. So what you realize when you're having to go through this test is people are just doing this to me because they can. You are acutely aware of how helpless you are. In order to get birth control, you have to undergo these tests. People are forcing you to undergo these tests that are painful and undignified, and the reason for it is not your good health. So the reason is because they can require these things. So that in itself is a harm. There's also a legal harm in that this, Delston makes an argument that this meets the standard of medical malpractice. If in any other circumstances somebody was required to undergo tests that were unnecessary, this would be regarded as medical malpractice. That's the kind of thing where, if they required you every time you went in for an annual checkup to get like a CAT scan or something, clearly you would be suspicious. It would be a way to make money. They spent the money on this CAT scan machine. They want to get money out of it. They want to charge your insurance. There would be all kinds of legal uproar. So why not in this case? And the main criticism, the main kind of harm that she focuses on in the book is moral harm. The harm, you are harmed in a way that you are not respected as a moral agent. And she specifies the different kinds of moral harm. It violates your autonomy. You're being forced to do something that you would choose not to do. And not for, this can happen to you in medical settings sometimes, but this is one of the major threads that runs through any bioethics course. The tension between respect for patient autonomy and the paternalistic desire to benefit the patient. So, for example, doctors are often faced with decisions. If, for example, a patient says, I don't want to undergo that treatment, and the doctor thinks, but this treatment has a good chance of saving your life, and if you don't undergo this treatment, you're much more likely to die. So now, of course, if a patient can just walk away, there's very little that can be done. But if, for example, the doctor had the power of the law behind him or her and could prevent the patient from walking away, then you get a real tension between autonomy and paternalism. Paternalism is this idea of the doctor acting like a parent and regarding the patient as like a child. So paternalism is intrinsically infantilizing, because when you act paternalistically to someone, you say, you're not capable of looking after yourself. Just like, we are with small children. With small children, we don't let them decide whether or not they go to the dentist or whether or not they get shots. In the days when kids did get shots and we didn't have measles outbreaks. But, it's not up to the kids to make that decision because they're not regarded as capable of knowing what is good for them. But of course, if you're doing that to an adult, then that's an insult to the adult. If they are otherwise competent, then we believe that you have a right to autonomy, that it is an intrinsic good to be able to exercise your own autonomy. One of the most important goods, I mean, it's freedom, and that's what the freedom that's supposed to be valuable in a free country. You're supposed to be given autonomy. And in the United States, you do have autonomy to buy an AR-15, but apparently you don't have the autonomy to get birth control without going through these unnecessary tests. So, of course, in the instance of birth control, a woman can say, I'm not going to undergo those tests, I'm just going to walk away. But, of course, if she does that, she doesn't get the birth control. The doctors control a resource that is very valuable and wanted. So it's paternalistic in perhaps the worst way. And it violates informed consent, because informed consent is where the consent a person gives is only binding if they have been provided with full information. So, for example, if you say, sign on the dotted line for this surgical procedure, and you say, is it risky? And they say, no, no, no. Well, if it really is risky, then them signing on the dotted line doesn't count, because your consent is only binding if you've been presented with the right information. And if doctors are actually saying, you have to have these tests, it's good for you, then that's not true. It's violating informed consent. And that, of course, undermines the doctor-patient relationship. Are you going to trust your doctor if you know that they're making you do things that are undignified and painful for no good reason? This is a major harm. So why is it that this happens? Why do we have this practice of requiring these tests where there doesn't seem to be a clear equivalent for anything that happens to men? And Delston argues it's an instance, it's a great illustration, not the only one by any means. And of course, she talks about, in later chapters, she talks about other areas, often to do with reproductive health, but not necessarily. There are other kinds of medical sexism, such as, for example, testing. Drugs is typically done on, or certainly historically has typically been done on males, so the correct dosages of drugs, that both sexes get is not really been tested for women. And if these drugs affect you differently depending on your hormones and your particular weight distribution, then women are effectively getting untested drugs. So there's those kind of things as well. This isn't the only kind of medical sexism, but it's a good, clear, vivid example, and it affects millions of women. So it's a good way to start. So she argues that the effect of this, the medical sexism that these kind of practices instantiate, is first of all hierarchical, in the sense that women are literally subordinated, in that their freedom is controlled, they don't get access to something. And think of why women want birth control. They want birth control because, women of the generation where the hormonal birth control was first introduced regard it as one of the most liberating events in female history, because it meant that you could have sex without becoming pregnant. And becoming pregnant is a huge stress on your body. It's a huge life event. It affects it may affect your entire life going forwards. It does enormously significant things to your body. I mean, even a wanted healthy pregnancy can permanently change your body. While you're pregnant, all of your organs are squished up into small places. Your bones literally change their structure and may not go back. You can get stretch marks that will never go away. You know, pregnancies can be fatal, and even when they're healthy, they change your body perhaps forever, which is why rich people, particularly Hollywood actresses, are avoiding it and getting surrogates these days. So being able to have sex, you know, and it's not just sex that necessarily women want. It's not just, you know, because the usual response is to say, well, if you don't want to get pregnant, don't have sex. First of all, that's not something that is ever said to a man, so that's sexist in itself. But secondly, it's not always a woman's choice whether or not she has sex, particularly in traditional marriages. So this this kind of attitude happens with birth control is in itself very significant, perhaps more so than any other kind of medicine, because birth control is this revolutionary thing that has liberated women, which is why women and activists are very alarmed that the overturning of Roe versus Wade is seen as a precursor to overturning Supreme Court decisions about birth control. And in fact, some of the activists whose goal was overturning Roe versus Wade have now turned their attention to overturning laws that give women the right to birth control cases. So it's hierarchical, it's institutional, just like we looked at institutional racism, and the slogan there was racism without racists. That is, once you have the structure in place, like redlining or whatever, then people who themselves have no racial animus, do not intend their actions to reinforce racism, and in fact may be the people who are affected by racism, nonetheless, by their action, ensure that racism persists and is passed on and is maintained, and the effects continue to be in effect. And of course, we saw the example of Ann Cudd's article where she illustrated a similar kind of phenomenon in what the vicious cycle invisible foot phenomenon, whereby once you have a certain set of circumstances of like a wage gap and so on, then even a non-sexist couple forced to make rational decisions in that context will end up making rational decisions that affect the position of the woman adversely, because it just makes sense for the man who has greater earning power to go out to work while the woman raises the kids. That's just the rationally sensible thing to do. So even if you're motivated just by self-interest and not at all motivated by sexism, you end up reinforcing it. Exactly the same kind of thing can happen here. You can have doctors who have no intention to be sexist and would rather not require these tests. Their licenses are on the line. If it is found that they give out birth control without requiring these tests, they can have their licenses revoked, and you know, what good can they do people then? And of course, nobody wants to start a new job just because they stood up for a principle. So it is self-perpetuating, and the people, doctors, reinforce it even if they do not have the bad intent. It's bad medicine because the point of this is not the good health of the women that are affected by it. It's instituted by people who want women controlled. The same people who want to revoke access to birth control altogether. This is just like before Roe versus Wade was overturned, abortion rights had been chipped away by people who were trying to basically make abortion access practically impossible without being able to make it illegal. So typical strategies were passing laws that affected abortion clinics. So you had to have a certain number of licensed physicians on staff. You had to have an entranceway that was a certain size. You had all of these restrictions that were totally unjustified medically passed into law with the purposeful intent of making the number of abortion clinics as small as possible because it became too prohibitively expensive to meet these legal requirements. This is exactly the same kind of strategy, only applied to birth control. And she gives a good illustration of why a lot of the restrictions that affect women are not justified in the way that people claim they're justified. So, for example, anti-abortion crusaders say that the reason they're opposed to abortion is because they think that fetuses are full human beings. And so it's just unfortunate. What they would argue is it's not our goal to violate the autonomy of women. Absolutely not. We have no sexist intent whatsoever. Our goal is purely to protect precious life. Now, it just so happens, given the circumstances of nature, that only people with uteruses can give birth, that women are affected by these restrictions, but that's not the intent. So it's not sexist. The intent is purely to save precious life. Well, if that were the case, says Delston, what about the rape and incest exceptions for abortion? Now, since that time, we've seen actually anti-abortion campaigners get more consistent and actually eliminate some of these exceptions. So there are certainly anti-abortion laws that have been, I'm not sure if there are any actually on the books. I think in Idaho they don't have an exception, but don't quote me on that, look that up. But yes, if you're going to be consistent and say this is just about saving small human beings, then there shouldn't be rape or incest exceptions. In other words, you shouldn't be able to get an abortion if you got pregnant because of rape or incest. Because, as some anti-abortion activists point out, it's not the fetus's fault how it was conceived, so it shouldn't have to die merely because it was conceived in the wrong way. Your right to life shouldn't depend on how you were conceived. So there are some consistent anti-abortionists who argue that way, but the majority certainly the majority of Americans are in favor of rape and incest exceptions. If there are abortion restrictions, they shouldn't apply in cases of rape and incest, which implies that the reason for not allowing you an abortion is not so much that you are pregnant, because you're pregnant in rape and incest as well, not so much the existence of a fetus, because there's fetuses in those cases as well, but to punish you for choosing to have sex, because that's the abortion that is not allowed, ones where you chose to have sex. So why is that so bad? it seems like women's autonomy is considered something that needs to be controlled, particularly women's autonomy in the context of their sexual behavior. So this carries on over into the discussion of Roe versus Wade, the article on Roe versus Wade. And some very interesting and important points stressed by the authors of this article. The first one is that it's not just a right to an abortion that is enshrined in Roe versus Wade, or was enshrined in Roe versus Wade. It is rights that women have while pregnant. And this includes women who have no intention of having an abortion, who are happily pregnant and wouldn't dream of seeking an abortion. They have rights because of Roe versus Wade that now that Roe versus Wade has been struck down, could be curtailed. So for example, suppose a woman who is pregnant through choice, wants to have this child, starts experiencing pregnancy complications and is going to have a miscarriage. If you're going to have a miscarriage, certain kinds of complications mean that you want to expel the fetus, which is at this point dead. You want to expel it fast. And there may be very serious complications, fatal complications, if you don't. So, in those kind of circumstances, you want it to be the case that there are doctors nearby who will remove the fetus, or ideally, the abortion drug, the medical abortion, medicinal abortion, which is this combination of mifepristone and misoprostol, one of which, I can't remember which, I think it's mifepristone, has been particularly targeted for restrictions. If those are not available, if there is not a doctor who basically has the skills of performing an abortion, because it's equivalently the same thing except that the fetus is already dead, if those are not around, you are much more likely to die. And this is women who wanted the baby, are devastated that this is happening, but because of effects of overturning Roe versus Wade, these kind of people are much more likely to die. In vitro fertilization. Yes, we saw that actually. One of the goals of the anti-abortion movement, if they are consistent and they genuinely believe that a fetus, that life begins at conception, that is, in some sense, the value of the life of a blastocyst, a tiny cluster of cells, is equivalent to you and me, just as valuable. If you genuinely believe this, then of course you are going to be opposed to the IVF industry, because the IVF industry, for one thing, destroys thousands upon thousands of fertilized eggs every year as just a par for the course, because one of the things, if you've gone through IVF, it's a very expensive process, and it's unlikely to work. So what they do is they give women hormones so that they produce a bunch of eggs, they fertilize a bunch of eggs, and they implant several eggs into a uterus, several fertilized eggs, hoping that one of them takes, because there's actually low chances of one of them takes. Right then and there, the fact that there's low chances of one of them taking means that you have created these little people knowing that they're much more likely to die than in, regular pregnancies. So right then and there, this shouldn't be allowed. And not only that, so it's not only risky in terms of the embryos are much more likely to die, but it's also the case that when one succeeds, they keep the rest of them frozen in case the same couple comes back and wants to do it again. for a certain period of time. And quite often, the same couple doesn't want to do it again and loses touch with the agency. And after a while, this is in the contract when you go there, they say, we will destroy these frozen embryos. We're not going to keep your embryos frozen just on the off chance that one day you come back. We can't afford to do that. We can't afford all this storage. So they say that after a certain amount of time, unless you come back, unless you pay, these get destroyed. So that's the destruction that happens. Thirdly, so remember, they implant several embryos at once because it's unlikely. If you just implanted one, it probably wouldn't take. It's a very expensive process. You would have to do it again. Going through it again is just prohibitively expensive. So implant a bunch at once, hope that they don't all implant. Occasionally, one or more than one does. That's probably okay. Twins. This is why fraternal twins are a lot more common these days because people are going through IVF. But occasionally you get a case like Autonomy or the McCoys, where 7 or 8 of these things implant. When that happens, the doctors say, we need to surgically reduce. We need to get rid of some of these because the human uterus is not designed, unlike some mammals, to take that many fetuses. It's not good for the fetuses. There's not enough resources to go around. So if you want healthy children, you should reduce some of those so that the ones that remain have all the resources that they need. Now, of course, in cases like the McCoys and Autonomy, they refuse to, and as a result, some of their children were born disabled, were born with disabilities, which the doctors said are as a result of being in too crowded uterus. So, but all of those things, of course, require destroying these tiny people. So if you genuinely believe, if your reason for being anti-abortion is that you believe we're slaughtering tiny people, then in vitro fertilization should absolutely be illegal. But that's unpopular. So the anti-abortion politicians, like, for example, President Trump, say, I'm protecting IVF. IVF is wonderful. IVF is about giving life. So I'm absolutely protecting IVF. But that's completely inconsistent because IVF involves the slaughter of millions of these embryos a year. So if you believe each and every one of them is a tiny, perfect child, you shouldn't allow IVF. Fetuses are not constitutional persons. That was one of the things that Roe versus Wade insisted on, that the only constitutional person in the case of a pregnant woman was the woman herself. Now, they did say, Roe does say, that the state has an interest in fetal life that is not insignificant and can be used to restrict women's rights to a certain extent, which is why in Roe it still allowed abortion restrictions after viability, which was considered about third term. So even with Roe in place, abortion could be restricted or outlawed past a certain stage in pregnancy when it was deemed that viability was had happened. But even in those cases, it couldn't make all abortions illegal. So abortion for the sake of the health of the mother had to be allowed even post-viability. This was the health exception that Roe required, which of course now that Roe has been overturned, there's no health exception. So the law can decide whose rights are more important, the fetus or the mother. And there are some laws that not only don't have a rape or incest exception, they don't have a mother's health exception. perhaps most interestingly and most overlooked of the way that Roe protected all women is it protected the autonomy of women while pregnant. Now, of course, and this is stressed by Delston as well, when I use the term women, I mean I'm using it in the biological sense. There are certainly trans women who would not be affected because they are not able to get pregnant. And there would also be trans men who can get pregnant whose autonomy was protected by Roe as well. So it's not actually all people who identify as women, and it's not only people who identify as women, which is why when writers want to acknowledge this, they talk about pregnant persons. And of course, the other side gets all annoyed when you use the phrase pregnant persons because they realize that this is allowing that there can be individuals who identify as men who still are able to get pregnant. So this in itself is a controversy. But anyway, anybody who can get pregnant, their rights were protected by Roe because Roe and a follow-up case that affirmed Roe, Casey versus Planned Parenthood, which overturned, it said that women do not have to, it overturned a law that required that women notify their husbands before they get an abortion. So think about that. You want an abortion, you have the right to an abortion at this stage. You did have the right to have an abortion, but you had to tell your husband. Now, what men would say is, yes, but it's my baby too, so I should have a say. But what if you're estranged from your husband? You know, you haven't got a divorce. Maybe he hasn't allowed you a divorce. Maybe this is a recent thing. Maybe one of the reasons you want an abortion is because he's become violent and you don't want a child with this person. Originally you did, so you became pregnant willingly, but things have changed. And now there's this law that says, no, you can't get an abortion without that person's permission. And of course, he doesn't give it. Think of the restrictions on your autonomy in that circumstance. Well, with Roe, that was overturned. You didn't have to give notice. Now, of course, there are plenty of laws that say someone underage has to notify their parents and cannot get an abortion unless their parents are told. And of course, sometimes the underage girl is pregnant because of her father, because of incest. And she has to get her father's permission for the abortion because of him. And that is still, of course, very much a thing. But the other thing is there are all kinds of behaviors that laws seek to restrict that would never be considered allowed to restrict for anybody but a pregnant person. So, for example, smoking. Obviously, you're not allowed to smoke in public spaces anymore, but certainly in your own home or in your own car, you can smoke, and nobody can stop you. They can say, "Oh, that's bad. You know, that gives you bad breath. That causes cancer. You shouldn't do it." But it's your right. Well, with Roe overturned, laws can be passed that would prohibit women from doing things like this, with the cost that if they violated this, they can be incarcerated. And this has happened, not necessarily with smoking, but with controlled substances. Now, of course, you could say, but they're illegal anyway. Well, not necessarily. There are cases where women have been incarcerated for using drugs where it was not illegal to use them. What was illegal, they were controlled in the sense that you couldn't deal them or possess them, but it was not illegal to use them. And if they had not been pregnant, they could not be incarcerated. So in other words, they're being incarcerated, their freedom is being curtailed because they are pregnant. And these kinds of restrictions are now possible. And there are cases, they talk about cases where women were put on trial for these kind of things before Roe was overturned, and some of them actually imprisoned. And certainly in places like El Salvador, now home of our new torture camp, in places like El Salvador and Mexico, where abortion has been illegal for a while, women are incarcerated for these kinds of things. Oh, there's the case of a woman who was almost imprisoned because she was in a car accident and it was found out she hadn't been wearing a seatbelt. Of course, nothing would have happened to her if it had just been her, but because she was pregnant, that was considered legitimate. There are cases where women have been confined to bed and said, you can't leave. There have been cases where women have been required. A woman has refused a C-section and her doctor overturned that decision. Now that's paternalism writ large. For example, yes, Renat Dre. In her case, a physician boldly documented in her chart, I have decided to overwrite the patient's refusal to have a C-section. A C-section is major surgery, and we don't even know if it was necessary. There was a case where a woman went into hiding so that she wouldn't be forced to have C-section and gave birth perfectly naturally and perfectly healthily. There are cases where if a doctor says that you shouldn't have a home birth, that in their opinion a home birth would be risky, you are risking incarceration. These are all actual cases. And there are cases where a woman was supposed to have a C-section because they thought she had an infection. They did the C-section against her wishes. There was no sign of the infection. They were wrong about that. So now the results, so this kind of increasing curtailment legally of a woman's autonomy has, of course, unintended effects. What it means is, if you're a drug user, you're not going to want contact with any doctor, because once the doctor finds out that you're a drug user, they're going to possibly shackle you until you give birth. So it's not in your interest to go to even free, if such things exist, even free pregnancy care, checkups that are necessary strongly advised for the health of the fetus. So this is called neonatal abstinence. Neonatal abstinence syndrome. That is, women are avoiding neonatal care because they are afraid that the doctors will report them. You can be, even if you're not imprisoned, you can be tried for child abuse. If, for example, fetuses get the rights of persons, then you are abusing a child if you imbibe drugs, alcohol, do risky things like working too late in the pregnancy. That could be regarded as child abuse. What if you have to? What if you have other children at home? And in fact, yes, that's the other thing. Most abortions are sought by women who already have children. And the reason for the abortions is often because they cannot look after the other children with a new baby, or they cannot afford the job that they can't keep up the job that they need to have to pay for the other children if they're pregnant. So the usual picture of a woman who hates children or whatever, and that's the reason they want an abortion, is not the usual person seeking an abortion. It's usually somebody who has children, maybe in a long-term relationship where loving, and they want children when they can, but this is not a situation where they can. So other effects of this increasing legal restrictions: more maternal deaths, of course, because abortions are far less risky than actually going to term. That's just a well-documented fact. Having an abortion is much less risky than being pregnant and going to term, because that's an incredibly major thing that happens to your body. So if abortions are made illegal, more women are going to die in childbirth. Abortions don't decline. This was predicted in this article, and actually abortions since overturning Roe were on a steady decline, and they've gone up. Abortions have gone up since overturning Roe. Now, the kinds of abortions have switched, so it's now overwhelmingly medicinal abortion, which is taking this cocktail of drugs. But of course, the other effect is abortion tourism. So you've got states, particularly states that are surrounded by states where abortion is legal, have become places that women have to travel to. Illinois is the abortion capital of America. Just thousands of women are traveling to Illinois because it's surrounded by. And another surprising one is Kansas. Why does Kansas have legal abortion? Because they had a referendum. In the other states where abortion is illegal, it wasn't a referendum. It was passed by, they're all Republican. It's all Republican-controlled states that have made abortion illegal. So they just passed laws, or in some cases, the laws were already on the books, waiting for when Roe was overturned. But in Kansas, they actually had a referendum saying, should it be enshrined? Same thing happened in Michigan, of course. But Kansas is a red state. And in a red state, it still went protecting abortion choice. And as a result, Kansas is a place that people in the surrounding states go to get abortions. So since Roe was overturned, actually abortions haven't declined. Of course, poor and minorities are most affected because they can't travel. They can't afford the travel. They can't leave. They have children. They have babies that they have to care for. They can't go to on a long journey, and they can't leave their children unattended. So it's the poor and minorities who are most affected by these restrictions and most affected by incarceration. So incarceration of women. Actually, women before Roe, when abortion was illegal in the past, first of all, it was never illegal in all states. There were always states where it was legal, like New York and so on. But even in the states where it was illegal, women weren't incarcerated. We didn't have the massive incarceration system that we have today. So that's just been a change since, over the course of the years of Roe, was the number of people incarcerated has gone through the roof, the number of women incarcerated has gone through the roof, and so you're much more likely to be incarcerated now than pre-Roe. Now, what if you argue, all right, yes, pregnant women's rights are being restricted, but again, it's unfortunate. These are little people, and we've got who's thinking of the children? Who's thinking of the little people? Yes, women's rights are going to be affected, but otherwise, who's going to protect the rights of the fetuses? Assuming that you legitimately believe that a small cluster of cells has all the rights of you or me. Well, even if you legitimately believe that, then the case McFall versus Shimp shows that when it's two male adults in question, nobody requires the one male adult to restrict his autonomy to save the life of the other. So this is it's famous in the abortion literature, but it's an actual case where I think it's McFall has a condition where he needs bone marrow transplant. I believe that's it. He needs a bone marrow transplant. Now, the only person who is found who has a match is his cousin, his distant cousin. They don't really know each other, Shimp. And he asks Shimp, will you donate bone marrow for a life-saving operation? And Shimp says, no, I don't wanna. So McFall sues him and demands that he donate bone marrow, because without it, McFall will die. And notice that donating bone marrow is much less of an inconvenience than being pregnant. It's like you just go in one day, you get the bone marrow removed. I don't know if it's even painful or if there's much of a recovery, but when you compare it to being pregnant for 9 months and the massive disruption to your body and the possible risks of dying are far greater in the cases of pregnancy than donating bone marrow. So Shimp, let's be honest, is a bit of a jerk here. But he is entirely within his rights, said the judge in the decision, and in fact invoked things like, the judge did two things. The judge says, Shimp, you're a selfish bastard. Well, he didn't use exactly those words, but, you know, made it clear. But he said, nonetheless, it's obviously the right call to deny McFall's request. And he said, we cannot go about saying you have to help you. That makes nonsense, says the judge, of the autonomy and the rights that America is founded on. He gives this very flowery speech and he says it's like, you know, if we allowed this, it would be like allowing vampires to suck on the necks of their victims and saying they have a right to do so. And he says it's like it would be encroaching on rights in the way that Nazi Germany did. He makes all of these allusions in this decision. So clearly the judge thinks Shimp, if Shimp was a good person, Shimp would help McFall. But he also says, in the American system we have, there is no way we can require Shimp to do this. So McFall died. Why is that relevant to pregnancy? Because by that reasoning, you shouldn't be able to restrict women's autonomy, even if you believe that a fetus has all of the rights of an adult human being. Because McFall obviously had the rights of an adult human being, and yet he was allowed to die because Shimp's right to bodily autonomy trumped McFall's right to life. So why isn't that the case for pregnant women? And the obvious answer is because women's autonomy is not valued. The old joke goes, you know, if men could be pregnant, I've forgotten who made this joke, but if men could be pregnant, then abortions would be available in vending machines. It's making the point that the reason for the restriction in cases of abortion is not really the life and rights of the individual. Even if we believe that right from conception, when it's just a cluster of cells, that they should have the rights of adults, McFall versus Shimp still says that we shouldn't restrict the autonomy of pregnant people just because they happen to contain other rights bearers. But of course, it's very controversial to suggest that a small cluster of cells should be given the rights of an adult human being anyway. And clearly our practice in vitro fertilization shows that we don't really believe that. Also, the rape and incest exceptions show that we don't really believe that these are people with rights. All right, so case studies, rather depressing case studies given the contemporary legal situation in the United States of medical sexism.